This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook. Chapter 18, Gita and the Good Doctor. There was little talk upon our arrival in Lisbon. We were all just glad to have solid ground beneath our feet after 2 weeks crossing a rough Atlantic Ocean. I certainly was. It was not much, Lisbon. A concrete docking area long enough to parallel park an ocean liner, a giant empty parking lot next to it, and that was it. Lisbon, Portugal. Had a name and presence even with me, a young boy, but landing and disembarking there was rather disappointing. I was expecting more. Of course, my mom reminded me we were only at a port. Ports are always dull, industrial-looking places, she pointed out. In contrast, the town of Lisbon, she suggested, was a charming Portuguese seaside village, steeped in medieval history and embellished with spectacular architecture on every cobbled street and every winding alley. She knew this to be fact, as she'd read all about it. Soon our luggage and gear were retrieved from the bowels of the TSS Olympia, and the porters helped Dad load the Eurovan. With wads of escudos dispersed and a scattering of conflicting directions offered up, accompanied by waving arms and wild gestures, we were off. The better side of Lisbon would have to wait. Copenhagen, its Little Mermaid, and a world regatta were expecting our entourage, and we understood it would be a bit of a haul. I wasn't old enough or proficient enough to be part of the global sailing team, so I had unsupervised time on my hands at the European racing events. To my thinking, this was a good thing. My most indelible memories of both Denmark and Finland were that they were windy and cold, with lots of large boulders everywhere. But also, even at age 10, it was apparent to me that there was a substantial lack of modesty among the populace. It was not unusual for men and women, young and very old, to run around buck naked in films, at the local theater, the beach, and the saunas. My youthful conclusion was that yachting races were little more than an excuse to become first hypothermic, then disrobe, climb into very hot wooden boxes, only to soon race steaming and naked down a rickety dock and finally jump headlong into a 45-degree North Sea. Oh, Scandinavia! Growing up in Miami, I was clearly unfamiliar with Nordic ways, but soon learned to admire their rich cultural amenities. In fact, my favorite one was a Finnish trinket brought home from the races in Turku. It was a ballpoint pen, adorned with the image of a bikini-clad woman. When flipped upside down, the ink disappeared, and the beauty's bathing suit went right along with it. I loved this pen, and carried it with me faithfully throughout our European tour and all the way back to Miami. When my dad caught me with it, he just chuckled. I thought better of taking it to school, as it would certainly have vanished in an instant. Copenhagen had lots of hot dog stands. I had no benchmark at the time, but certainly do today. No New York City's Sabraze wiener can possibly compete. The Danish variety did not come with buns. They were delivered in a brown paper wrapper, fragrant and steamy in their own natural casing, with a dab of spicy brown mustard on the side. That was it. It was not have it your way. It was have it the Danish way. The dogs were richly seasoned and popped when bitten. Snappy. Long and skinny, too. With Norway and Sweden to the north and Russia to the east, one could appreciate that it was usually chilly in Copenhagen. It was no surprise that the dog stands, with their warm and tasty wares, peppered the landscape. Dad was an instant Danish wiener addict, and every chance he had to escape the duties of the regatta, he would. I could find him down the street, chewing away with a big smile. The good doctor, recently divorced, came along on this trip. He had been a fixture on others as well, but his demeanor had changed. He seemed reborn and reinvigorated, a new man. To my memory, he had a young daughter who competed with the team. Other than being tiny in stature, really a wisp of a kid, she was not notable, in that she did not frequently place in our local races at Coral Reef. She was a very nice girl and was well respected by her teammates, just not a world beater, quite yet. Her dad was a genuinely great guy, always friendly, enthusiastic, and offering to help. I was not sure he had spent much time around sailboats, however. On more than one occasion, he would try to assist with simple rigging on his daughter's small pram and would tangle it up. She would just thank him, but make it clear that she could take care of it just fine on her own. Her dad would chuckle, pat her on the head, and hobble off to the bar. He had suffered from polio as a young child and moved around with an exaggerated limp. We had hardly arrived in Copenhagen and begun our jet lag recovery when the good doctor was on the move. With his painful divorce now behind him, his Scandinavian female radar had been fully deployed, tuned to maximum sensitivity. Thinking back, I believe the actual sailboat racing for him was but a secondary consideration. As a team, we tended to move as a group as we traveled from venue to venue. I will not say it was the first meal we had upon arrival, but it certainly could have been when our raucous group of young American sailors overtook a small eatery along the roadside. We were famished. The manager hurried to move several small tables together to accommodate the abnormally large American crew. No sooner had we settled into our seats and began to try interpreting the menus than she made her appearance. Miss Gita, Scando waitress extraordinaire. Though myself a prepubescent boy, even I knew she was a striking woman. Gita was tall and slender, in superb shape. I imagined between shifts waitressing, she probably hiked vigorously through mountain valleys carpeted with colorful wildflowers, or hustled through the countryside on a sleek racing bike, or perhaps glided across mountain lakes in a swift sloop. She wore a tightly tailored, short blue waitress uniform. Her legs stretched all the way to Finland, and her brilliant natural blonde hair cascaded down over her shoulders and delightfully framed her more than ample bosom. While many of the young American sailor boys glanced nervously at Gita and giggled, the dads made their best attempt to pretend they had hardly noticed her as they buried their faces in the fascinating menus of schnitzel and soup. Except for the good doctor, that is. He was radar locked and loaded at first sight. The wives creased their eyebrows, glanced at one another, and generally scowled. Miss Gita was the most exuberant of waitresses and reveled in working the tables, gracefully making her rounds, translating and giggling and translating some more. She was truly a charming young woman, full of vigor and enthusiasm. Miss Gita was also a natural people person, a label popularized more than a decade later, and genuinely enjoyed this hearty group of American athletes and their beautiful families. Drinks were served all around, with wine and cocktails for the parents and Coca-Cola for the team. It got loud as the long and eventful trip from Miami was recounted in entertaining detail. Miss Gita scurried about, filling water glasses and bringing more drinks and soon appetizers, and then entrees galore. We had schnitzel and noodles and breads and soup and fish of all types and sizes. Increasingly, the good doctor had many a need, and Miss Gita responded with the utmost grace and impressive Scandinavian charm. She wanted him to tell her all about this place called Miami, Florida. Was it cold? Very far away? What did people do there? Were there mountains? Palm trees? He was more than attentive and had all the answers. The good doctor was clearly enjoying himself at the Danish regatta. Even for me, it was a shock a few days later to see them both stroll up arm in arm as the racing got underway. Heads turned and the whispers flew about with more chill and velocity than the 30-knot offshore blaster the poor sailors endured that day. Within a couple of weeks, the regatta was brought to a painful close. The Americans, not practiced in the art of sailing in high winds, 45 degrees summer weather and 3-foot chop, we did have a wonderful time, nonetheless. At least I certainly did. It was on those chilly, rocky shores that more young and old people than I could count took to completely disrobing as they frolicked on the frigid beaches. I was too young to have even seen my first hint of pubic hair, but in short order I knew what I was likely to be contending with before long, and frankly was not sure how I felt about it. And oh, the naked breasts. They were at every turn, jiggling, bouncing, sagging, and swaying. There were large nipples and small nipples, soft nipples, and some, I swear, were permanently frozen at attention. Based on the icy conditions, they probably were. Glutea maximi were also out in shocking display. Some were impossibly bulbous, and others as flat as pancakes. There were puckered up ones, looking more like a head of cauliflower, and thankfully, a few that were smooth and white, like chunks of finely polished marble, befitting the best museum-grade Italian sculpture. All the bare flesh had me in an immediate and constant sensory overload. Strangely, I do not remember a single belly button, so distracted I had become. Certainly, Scandinavians had belly buttons, but whether they were innies or outies or some other unique variety, I cannot say. Finally, looking was clearly an accepted practice, and just fine with all in attendance. Look I did, a lot. But strangely, back inside in the warmest and coziest of restaurants, cafes, and shops, there was wool everywhere. All the Scandinavians were bundled up in all manner of sweaters and hats and boots and scarves. What was it about freezing cold, inclement weather that had these people wanting to disrobe completely in front of family, friends, and total strangers, frolic on icy cold stones, and swim in the near freezing Baltic? Yet inside, against the warmth of a raging fire, only layers of wool would do. Way up by the North Pole, they are indeed a funny bunch. The flight back to Miami via New York was another shocker. As we all struggled into our seats, carrying way too many souvenirs and worked to settle in for the long, brutal flight home, who hobbled down the aisle but the good doctor and Miss Gita? Shock was replaced by disbelief and then uproarious cheers as he announced that Miss Gita was in fact now Mrs. Dr. Shepherd. The flight became the wedding reception they had not planned. Champagne flowed and rows 10 through 22 morphed into a large party zone. The sleek silver airliner, filled with cigarette smoke and drunken celebrants, roared across the Atlantic in the dark night with a defeated yet unbowed American team and a couple of verily unlikely newlyweds enjoying the party of their lives. A month later, back on Biscayne Bay, I had somehow been conscripted to join the committee boat for a Saturday afternoon series of races. I did not know how I could have possibly picked the short straw and been dragged on board. So many other capable candidates were nearby, and so many other far more interesting activities awaited me at the club. There was the adjacent marina, active and bustling with forklifts hoisting large cruisers to and fro, the inviting freshwater pool, or the snack bar, where glorious cheeseburgers were grilled by two charming black women, one rather large and the other equally thin, Sarah and Amy. The burgers came with a thick slice of red onion and American cheese by request. I could explore the muddy boat launching lagoon, packed with a variety of crabs and nasty-looking bottom-feeding fish, or best of all, the abandoned 1920s mansion across the lagoon behind a tall chain-link fence. Lobster and I often scaled the fence and entered the estate through a broken back door to explore this amazing relic of a bygone era. adorned with hand-laid Italian tile, cascading terraces, and arched walkways at every turn. But alas, I was a conscript for the day. Out on the bay there was little for me to do but watch the grass grow, as in a sailboat race, drink cold Coca-Cola, and fidget. The committee was in a festive mood, a sunny Biscayne Bay their playground, while their children tacked back and forth before them, giving it their all to outdo one another racing tiny boats at no more than 3 knots. Cold beers were popped and the occasional scotch was poured. This was Little League in another league at a very different time. I rowed around the stern of the stinkpot, as serious sailors called any craft without a sail. The last race was midway now. The prams were approaching the windward mark, so I knew from experience, as long as no one capsized, I would be headed back to the club, the snack bar, and the freshwater pool within the hour. My prospects were looking up. Thinking through the appealing options that lay ahead, a cheeseburger with chips, a swim in the cool pool, and maybe a hike up to the top of the old forbidden tower above the clubhouse, I was more and more ready to disembark. Just then, Gita appeared. She had also been part of the committee all along that day, but I just hadn't noticed. She must have been napping in one of the berths below deck. In any event, she strode up to the good doctor and explained in her funny, broken English how she was expiring from the heat and would like to take a cooling dip in the bay. Was there time? Of course, was his reply. With that, Gita said nothing more. In an instant, she stripped off her colorful bikini and dropped it with a flick of her hand onto the teak deck. She stepped buck naked onto the transom of the boat and balanced on her toes for a few glorious moments. I believe time stood still. Waves stopped mid-break. Flags froze mid-flutter. She arched her sinuous back, thrust out every part of her curvy scandal physique, and executed a glorious swan dive right into the tepid waters of Biscayne Bay. Complete and utter silence enveloped the committee boat. Not a single member was sure of what they thought they saw, but in fact had seen. So spectacular was the carnal image that had just passed before their eyes. In a few moments, that seemed like days, breathing resumed. The Commodore spewed forth a mouthful of beer. Gasps and moans and a few croaks were peppered with some giggles and light laughter before one of the committee men had the audacity to burst into a raucous clap and cheer, "Oh, Gita!" As I sipped on my cold Coca-Cola and gazed upon Gita splashing about in the warm water, I was immediately struck by a simple and irrefutable fact. A person who dives from a boat into the bay must, before too long, either swim to shore or return to the boat. A mile and a half offshore, I was betting that if the first thrill I had just enjoyed was not stimulating enough, I would soon be presented with Act 2. Thankfully, it was not too long before Gita completed her aquatic exercise program. She was thoroughly refreshed. Rather than swim to shore, she chose, as expected, to return to the committee boat, as many others also had hoped, at least the men. As she backstroked to the ladder, there was a small crush of gallant gentlemen stepping forward to help her up the steps, but the good doctor beat them all to it, even with his pronounced limp. Somehow he had secured a very large beach towel, and as she began her immodest climb up the ladder, he quickly and quite securely wrapped up her dripping, wet, scando body, snug and tight. Shortly afterwards, as we pulled up anchor and began the slow trawl back to the club, who won the race that day remains a mystery, I could see the good doctor up on the bow, counseling the giggling Gita on the protocols of swimming in Miami's Biscayne Bay. It was to be a short and relaxing getaway to the Bahamas, and then Lobster delivered a crabby ending. Up next is Chapter 19, and it's called Chasing Crustaceans.